In this short video from today, we will tell you about a hero who started his career and what services he gave to the world and passed away. In this video of today, you will get to see the story of a hero about whom you will feel very proud to know, so keep wasting your time in this video of today. Let's start this informative video of today. Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev, December 19, 1906 to November 10, 1982. Was a Soviet politician who served as General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union from 1964 until his death in 1982, as well as chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet Head of State. From 1960 to 1964 and 1977 to 1982. His 18-year tenure as General Secretary was second only to Joseph Stalin's in length. Historians continue to dispute the importance of Brezhnev's time as General Secretary. While his reign was marked by political stability and substantial foreign policy accomplishments, it was also marked by corruption, inefficiency, economic stagnation, and fast-widening technology gaps with the West. Brezhnev was born into a working-class family in Kamenskoye, now Kamiansk, Ukraine, then part of the Russian Empire's Yekaterinoslav Governorate. After the October Revolution resulted in the formation of the Soviet Union, Brezhnev joined the Communist Party's Youth League in 1923 before becoming an official member in 1929. When Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union in June 1941, he joined the Red Army as a commissar and advanced quickly through the ranks, eventually becoming a major general during World War II. After the war, Brezhnev was promoted to the party's Central Committee in 1952 and climbed to become a full member of the Politburo in 1957 in 1964. He gained enough authority to succeed Nikita Khrushchev as first secretary of the CPSU, the most influential position in the country. During his tenure, Brezhnev's conservative, pragmatic style to government strengthened the Soviet Union's international reputation while maintaining the ruling party's domestic position. Whereas Khrushchev frequently implemented programs without consulting the rest of the Politburo, Brezhnev took pains to reduce discontent among the party elite by obtaining decisions by consensus, restoring collective leadership in the Kremlin. Furthermore, while advocating for détente between the two Cold War superpowers, he achieved nuclear parity with the US and increased the Soviet Union's dominance in Central and Eastern Europe. Furthermore, the significant military buildup under Brezhnev's leadership, widespread military interventionism significantly increased the Soviet Union's influence abroad, particularly in the Middle East and Africa, though these endeavors, particularly the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, proved to be extremely costly and put a strain on the Soviet economy later on. In contrast, Brezhnev's contempt for political change precipitated the Brezhnev stagnation, a period of socio-economic degradation. In addition to widespread corruption and slowing economic growth, this decade saw an expanding technology disparity between the Soviet Union and the United States. Mikhail Gorbachev, who took office in 1985, chastised Brezhnev's government for its inefficiency and rigidity before pursuing steps to liberalize the Soviet Union. After 1975, Brezhnev's health progressively deteriorated and he retreated from international activities while maintaining his control. He died on November 10, 1982 and was succeeded as General Secretary by Yuri Andropov. Early life and early career. 1906 to 1939, origins. Brezhnev was born on December 19, 1906, in Kamenskoye, now Kamiansk, Ukraine, in the Russian Empire's Yekaterinoslav Governorate, to metalworker Ilya Yakovlevich Brezhnev, 1874 to 1934. And his wife, Natalia Denisovna Mazalova, 1886 to 1975. His parents resided in Brezhnevo-Kursky district, Kursk Oblast, Russia, before relocating to Kamenskoye. Brezhnev's ethnicity was listed as Ukrainian in some documents, like as his passport, and Russian in others. In his book Memories, 1979, he wrote, metallurgist, which confirms that he considered himself to be Russian. And so, according to nationality, I am Russian, I am a proletarian, a hereditary metallurgist. Like many young people in the years following the Russian Revolution of 1917, he obtained a technical education, first in land management and subsequently in metallurgy. He graduated from Kamenskoye Metallurgical Technicum in 1935 and worked as a metallurgical engineer in eastern Ukraine's iron and steel sectors. Brezhnev joined the Communist Party's youth organization, the Komsomol, in 1923, then the party itself in 1929. He served in the military from 1935 to 1936 as required. After studying at a tank school, he worked as a political commissar in a tank factory. During Stalin's Great Purge, Brezhnev was one of several apparatchiks who took advantage of the resulting gaps in the government and party to rise quickly through the regime's ranks. In 1936, he was appointed director of the Dnipropetrovsk Metallurgical Technicum, a technical college, and relocated to the regional capital of Dnipropetrovsk. In May 1937, he was appointed deputy chairman of the Kamenskoye City Soviet. After Nikita Khrushchev took over the Ukrainian Communist Party in May 1938, he was appointed head of the Dnipropetrovsk Regional Communist Party's propaganda department, and then, in 1939, a regional party secretary in charge of the city's defense industries. 11. Here, he took the first moves toward forming a network of followers that became known as the Dnipropetrovsk Mafia. That would significantly boost his ascension to power. 1941 to 1945, World War II. Brezhnev, right, with the position of commissar, gives a Communist Party membership card to a soldier. 1942. When Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, Brezhnev, like most middle-level party officials, was instantly drafted. He assisted in the evacuation of Dnipropetrovsk's industry prior to the city's capture by the Germans on August 26 and was later appointed political commissar. Brezhnev was promoted to brigade commissar colonel in October as the Southern Front's political administration deputy. When the Germans occupied Ukraine in 1942, Brezhnev was deployed to the Caucasus as the Transcaucasian Front's deputy head of political administration. In April 1943, he was appointed to command the 18th Army's political department. Later that year, the 18th Army joined the 1st Ukrainian Front when the Red Army reclaimed the initiative and marched westward across Ukraine. Nikita Khrushchev, the front's chief political commissar, had backed Brezhnev's career since before the war. Brezhnev first met Khrushchev in 1931, shortly after joining the party, and as he advanced through the ranks, he became Khrushchev's protege. Brezhnev served as the head political commissar of the 4th Ukrainian Front, which invaded Prague in May 1945 following the German surrender. Rise to power. Promotion to the Central Committee. Brezhnev left the Soviet Army as a major general in August 1946. He'd spent the entire war as a political commissar, not a military commander. In May 1946, he was named the first secretary of the Zaporizhzhia Regional Party Committee, and his deputy was Andrei Kirilenko, a key member of the Dnipropetrovsk Mafia. After working on restoration projects in Ukraine, he returned to Dnipropetrovsk in January 1948 to serve as regional First Party secretary. Brezhnev was appointed a deputy to the Soviet Union's highest legislative body, the Supreme Soviet, in 1950. In July of that year, he was dispatched to the Moldavian SSR and made party first secretary of the Communist Party of Moldova, where he was in charge of finishing the implementation of collective agriculture. Konstantin Chernenko, a faithful member of the Mafia, was in Moldova as head of the Agitprop department, and one of the people Brezhnev brought with him from Dnipropetrovsk was Nikolai Shelikov, the future USSR Minister of the Interior. In 1952, he met with Stalin, who then promoted Brezhnev to the Communist Party's Central Committee as a candidate member of the Presidium, previously the Politburo, 16. And appointed him one of the Central Committee's 10 secretaries. Stalin died in March 1953, and during the subsequent reorganization, Brezhnev was relegated to first deputy chief of the Army and Navy's political directorate. Advancement under Khrushchev. Khrushchev, Brezhnev's supporter, succeeded Stalin as General Secretary and Georgy Malenkov, Khrushchev's opponent, as Chairman of the Council of Ministers. Brezhnev supported Khrushchev against Malenkov, but only for a few years. He was appointed second secretary of the Communist Party of the Kazakh SSR in February 1954 and promoted to general secretary in May when Khrushchev defeated Malenkov. On the surface, his mission was straightforward: to make the new lands agriculturally productive. In actuality, Brezhnev got involved in the development of Soviet missile and nuclear weapons programs, notably the Baikonur Cosmodrome. The initially effective Virgin Lands campaign quickly became unproductive and failed to address the escalating Soviet food crisis. Brezhnev was recalled to Moscow in 1956. The crop in the years after the Virgin Lands campaign was dismal, which would have harmed his political future if he stayed in Kazakhstan. In February 1956, Brezhnev returned to Moscow and was appointed a candidate member of the Politburo in charge of the defense industry, the space program, including the Baikonur Cosmodrome, heavy industry, and Capitol building. He was now a senior member of Khrushchev's entourage, and in June 1957 he supported Khrushchev in his conflict with Malenkov's Stalinist Old Guard in the party leadership, the so-called anti-party group. After the Stalinists were defeated, Brezhnev was promoted to full Politburo membership. In May 1960, he was appointed to chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, making him the nominal head of state, albeit Khrushchev wielded real power as first secretary of the Soviet Communist Party and premier. Replacement of Khrushchev as Soviet leader. Khrushchev's position as party head was solid until around 1962, but as he became older, his behavior became more erratic, undermining the confidence of his fellow leaders. The Soviet Union's rising economic troubles also put strain on Khrushchev's leadership. Brezhnev remained publicly loyal to Khrushchev, but he became involved in a 1963 attempt to depose him, possibly as a leader. In 1963, Brezhnev succeeded Frol Kozlov, another Khrushchev protege, as secretary of the Central Committee, establishing himself as Khrushchev's likely successor. Khrushchev appointed him second secretary, or deputy party head, in 1964. Brezhnev Center went hunting with Khrushchev far left and Finnish President Urho Kekkonen, second from right, in 1963, a year before Khrushchev was deposed. Khrushchev returned from Scandinavia and Czechoslovakia in October 1964, uninformed of the conspiracy, and went on vacation to the Black Sea resort of Pitsunda. Upon his return, his Presidium officers commended him on his performance in office. Anastas Mikoyan paid a visit to Khrushchev, advising him not to be overconfident in his current circumstances. Vladimir Semichastny, the head of the KGB, was an important part of the conspiracy because it was his responsibility to alert Khrushchev if anyone was conspiring against his leadership. Nikolai Ignatov, whom Khrushchev had dismissed, discreetly sought the advice of many Central Committee members. After some false beginnings, fellow conspirator Mikhail Suslov called Khrushchev on October 12 and urged that he return to Moscow to discuss the status of Soviet agriculture. Finally, Khrushchev realized what was going on and told Mikoyan, "If the question is about me, I will not fight it." While a minority led by Mikoyan planned to remove Khrushchev from the role of first secretary while keeping him as the chairman of the Council of Ministers, the majority, Brezhnev and his followers intended to completely remove him from active politics. Brezhnev and Nikolai Podgorny addressed the Central Committee, criticizing Khrushchev for economic failures and accusing him of voluntarism and immodest behavior. Influenced by Brezhnev's friends, Politburo members agreed to remove Khrushchev from office on October 14. Some Central Committee members wanted him to be punished in some way, but Brezhnev, who had already been assured the position of General Secretary, saw little reason to punish Khrushchev further. Brezhnev was chosen first secretary on the same day, but was first regarded as a transitory leader who would just keep the shop until another leader was appointed. Alexei Kosygin was appointed as head of government. Mikoyan was kept as the head of state. 26. Brezhnev and his comrades backed the general party line adopted following Stalin's death. But they believed Khrushchev's changes had eroded much of the Soviet Union's stability. According to the plotters, Khrushchev was in contempt of the party's collective ideals because he consistently overruled other party members. The Soviet publication Pravda discussed new permanent topics such as collective leadership, scientific planning, expert consultation, organizational regularity, and the end of schemes. When Khrushchev departed the public eye, there was little fanfare, as most Soviet residents, even the intelligentsia, expected a period of stability, steady development of Soviet society, and continued economic expansion in the coming years. Political scientist George W. Breslau compared Khrushchev and Brezhnev as leaders. He contends that their personalities and the state of public opinion dictated the paths they followed to establish legal authority. Khrushchev attempted to decentralize the government structure and empower local leaders who had previously been completely obedient. Brezhnev sought to consolidate control, even weakening the responsibilities of the other members of the Central Committee and the Politburo. 1964 to 1982, leader of the Soviet Union. When Brezhnev succeeded Khrushchev as the party's first secretary, he became the Soviet Union's de facto ultimate ruler. However, he was originally obliged to govern as part of an unofficial triumvirate, also known as Troika in Russian, with the country's premier, Alexei Kosygin, and Nikolai Podgorny, a CPSU Central Committee secretary and eventually Presidium chairman. Due to Khrushchev's disrespect for the rest of the Politburo in combining his party leadership with that of the Soviet government, a plenum of the Central Committee in October 1964 prohibited any single man from holding both the positions of General Secretary and Premier. This arrangement lasted until the late 1970s, when Brezhnev solidified his position as the most dominant figure in the Soviet Union. During his consolidation of power, Brezhnev had to deal with the ambitions of Alexander Shelepin, the former KGB chairman and current head of the Party State Control Committee. In early 1965, Shelepin began pushing for the restoration of obedience and order in the Soviet Union as part of his own power grab. To this purpose, he used his power over both state and party organs to gain support inside the dictatorship. Recognizing Shelepin's potential threat to his position, Brezhnev galvanized the Soviet collective leadership to remove him from the Party State Control Committee before having the body dissolved altogether on December 6, 1965. By the end of 1965, Brezhnev had removed Podgorny from the Secretariat, severely limiting the latter's capacity to gain support inside the party machinery. In the years that followed, Podgorny's network of followers dwindled as the protégés he built during his ascent to prominence were ousted from the Central Committee. By 1977, Brezhnev was confident enough in his position to succeed Podgorny as head of state and dismiss him from the Politburo. After dismissing Shelepin and Podgorny as threats to his leadership in 1965, Brezhnev focused his attention on his remaining political challenger, Alexei Kosygin. In the 1960s, U.S. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger saw Kosygin as the primary leader of Soviet foreign policy in the Politburo. During the same period, Kosygin was also in charge of economic administration as chairman of the Council of Ministers. However, his standing diminished as he implemented a series of economic reforms in 1965, which became known within the party as the Kosygin reforms. The reforms, which coincided with the Prague Spring, whose severe divergence from the Soviet model led to its armed repression in 1968, sparked a backlash among the party's old guard, who then flocked to Brezhnev, strengthening his position within the Soviet leadership. After a clash with Second Secretary Mikhail Suslov in 1969, Brezhnev stretched his influence even more, and Suslov never questioned his supremacy inside the Politburo again. Brezhnev excelled at politics within the Soviet power system. He was a team player who never acted recklessly or quickly. Unlike Khrushchev, he did not make judgments without extensive engagement with his colleagues and was always open to hearing their perspectives. In the early 1970s, Brezhnev strengthened his domestic position. In 1977, he forced Podgorny's retirement and was re-elected chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union, a role similar to that of an executive president. While Kosygin remained premier until shortly before his death in 1980, he was succeeded by Nikolai Tikhonov. Brezhnev ruled the Soviet Union from the mid-1970s until his death in 1982. Domestic policies. Ideological development. Brezhnev described the famous developed socialism as Soviet-style socialism, which he claimed had effectively built socialism in the Soviet Union and reached Vladimir Lenin's stage of transition from socialism to communism. Brezhnev stressed the USSR's great technological advancements, including full electrification, the use of nuclear power in industry, computer planning, and highly mechanized agriculture. He claimed that the USSR's highly developed production force had brought all social strata closer together than ever before. As a result, according to Brezhnev, the proletarian dictatorship has evolved into a popular government. Brezhnev felt that all socialist countries will experience the same socialist development and social transformation of the Soviet paradigm regardless of national and material circumstances. Repression. Yuri Andropov, the chairman of the KGB, presided over the widespread crackdown under Brezhnev's dictatorship. Brezhnev's stability program included reversing Khrushchev's liberalizing reforms and restricting cultural freedom. During the Khrushchev era, Brezhnev supported the leader's condemnation of Stalin's arbitrary authority, the rehabilitation of many Stalin purge victims, and the gradual reform of Soviet intellectual and cultural policy. However, as soon as he became leader of the Soviet Union, he began to reverse this progress, adopting an increasingly authoritarian and conservative stance. By the mid-1970s, there were an estimated 5,000 political and religious prisoners in the Soviet Union, living in deplorable conditions and malnourished. The Soviet regime deemed many of these inmates mentally ill and incarcerated them in mental asylums throughout the Soviet Union. Under Brezhnev's leadership, the KGB penetrated most, if not all, anti-government organizations, ensuring that there was little to no opposition to him or his power structure. Brezhnev, on the other hand, avoided the outright violence that characterized Stalin's tenure. The trial of writers Yuli Daniel and Andrei Sinyavsky in 1966, the first such public trials since Stalin's reign, heralded a return to restrictive cultural policies. Under Yuri Andropov, the State Security Service, in the form of the KGB, regained some of the powers it had enjoyed under Stalin, but the purges of the 1930s and 1940s were not repeated. And Stalin's legacy remained widely despised among the Soviet intellectuals. Economics. Economic growth until 1973. Between 1960 and 1970, Soviet agricultural output climbed by 3% each year. Industry also improved. Under the 8th Five-Year Plan, 1966 to 1970, factory and mine output climbed by 138% over 1960. While the Politburo became increasingly anti-reformist, Kosygin was able to persuade both Brezhnev and the Politburo to leave reformist communist leader János Kadar of the Hungarian People's Republic alone as a result of an economic reform known as the New Economic Mechanism, NEM, which allowed for the establishment of limited retail markets. In the Polish People's Republic, another strategy was pursued in 1970 under the leadership of Edward Gierek, who believed that Western loans were required to assist the rapid growth of heavy industries. The Soviet leadership approved this because the Soviet Union could not afford to continue providing enormous subsidies to the Eastern Bloc in the form of low-cost oil and gas exports. In 1968, the Warsaw Pact invaded Czechoslovakia in reaction to Alexander Dubček's reforms, demonstrating the Soviet Union's resistance to some reforms. 55 under Brezhnev. The Politburo rejected Khrushchev's decentralization efforts. Brezhnev dismantled the regional economic councils, which were established to administer the Soviet Union's regional economy in 1966, 2 years after seizing control. The 9th Five-Year Plan resulted in a shift For the first time, industrial consumer goods outproduced industrial capital goods. Watches, furniture, and radios were all made in large quantities. The plan still allocated the majority of the state's investment to industrial capital goods production. The majority of leading party bureaucrats within the administration did not consider this outcome as a promising indicator for the Soviet state's future. By 1975, consumer products were growing at a 9% slower rate than capital goods. Despite Brezhnev's promise to make a swift shift in investment to satisfy Soviet consumers and raise living standards even more, the strategy remained unchanged. This did not occur. During 1928 to 1973, the Soviet Union was growing economically at a quicker pace than the United States and Western Europe. However, establishing objective comparisons is difficult. The Soviet Union was hampered by the effects of World War II, which had left most of the Western USSR in ruins. However, Western aid and Soviet espionage in the period 1941 to 1945, culminating in cash, material, and equipment deliveries for military and industrial purposes, had allowed the Russians to leapfrog many Western economies in the development of advanced technologies, particularly in the fields of nuclear technology, radio communications, agriculture, and heavy manufacturing. By the early 1970s, the Soviet Union possessed the world's second greatest industrial capacity, manufacturing more steel, oil, pig iron, cement, and tractors than any other country. Before 1973, the Soviet economy grew faster than the American economy, albeit by a slight margin. The USSR likewise maintained a constant pace with the Western European economies. Between 1964 and 1973, the Soviet economy produced around half the production per capita of Western Europe and slightly more than one-third that of the United States. In 1973, the process of catching up with the rest of the West came to a halt as the Soviet Union slipped farther and further behind in computer technology, which proved critical for Western businesses. By 1973, the era of stagnation had become clear. Economic stagnation until 1982. The era of stagnation, a term coined by Mikhail Gorbachev, was attributed to a compilation of factors including the ongoing arms race, the Soviet Union's decision to participate in international trade, thereby abandoning the idea of economic isolation while ignoring changes occurring in Western societies, increased authoritarianism in Soviet society, the invasion of Afghanistan, the bureaucracy's transformation into an undynamic gerontocracy, lack of economic reform, domestically, social. Stagnation was fueled by rising demand for unskilled workers, labor shortages, and a drop in productivity and labor discipline. Brezhnev attempted to overhaul the economy in the late 1960s and 1970s, although sporadically through Alexei Kosygin, but produced no significant outcomes. One of these reforms was the economic reform of 1965, which Kosygin began, but its antecedents are sometimes dated back to the Khrushchev era. The Central Committee finally canceled the change, although admitting that economic issues existed. Gorbachev described the Soviet Union's economy under Brezhnev's tenure as the lowest stage of socialism after assuming power. The CIA estimated that the Soviet economy peaked in the 1970s, accounting for 57% of American GNP. However, beginning around 1975, economic growth began to slow, owing at least in part to the regime's continued priority on heavy industries and military investment over consumer products. Furthermore, Soviet agriculture failed to feed the metropolitan population, let alone provide for a higher standard of living, which the government promised as the rewards of mature socialism and on which industrial productivity was based. Finally, the GNP growth rate decreased to 1% to 2% annually. As GNP growth rates fell in the 1970s from their peak in the 1950s and 1960s, they began to lag behind Western Europe and the US. The stagnation eventually reached a point where the United States began to expand at a rate of 1% per year, higher than the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's stagnant economy was exacerbated by its ever-widening technology deficit with the West. Because of the centralized planning system's complex procedures, Soviet companies were unable to innovate in response to public demand. This was particularly evident in the world of computers. In reaction to the Soviet computer industry's lack of universal standards for peripherals and digital capacity, Brezhnev's leadership prohibited all independent computer development and mandated that all future models be based on the IBM/360 platform. However, after adopting the IBM/360 system, the Soviet Union was never able to produce enough platforms, much less improve on its architecture. As its technology fell further behind that of the West, the Soviet Union became more reliant on piracy. The last significant reform implemented by the Kosygin government, and some believe in the pre-perestroika era, was a joint decision of the Central Committee and the Council of Ministers titled Improving Planning and Reinforcing the Effects of the Economic Mechanism on Raising the Effectiveness of Production and Improving the Quality of Work, also known as the 1979 reform. The reform, unlike the 1965 reform, attempted to boost the central government's economic engagement by expanding the ministry's tasks and responsibilities. Following Kosygin's death in 1980, and due to his successor Nikolai Tikhonov's conservative attitude to economics, little of the change was implemented. The Soviet Union's 11th five-year plan produced a dismal result, a shift in growth from 5 to 4%. The preceding 10th five-year plan set a target of 6.1% growth, which was not fulfilled. Brezhnev was able to defer economic catastrophe by trading with Western Europe and the Arab world. During the Brezhnev era, the Soviet Union continued to outproduce the United States in the heavy industrial sector. Another significant outcome of Brezhnev's administration was that many Eastern Bloc countries grew more economically advanced than the Soviet Union. Agricultural policy. Brezhnev's agriculture policy encouraged conventional methods of managing collective farms while centralizing output quotas. Despite record-high governmental investment in farming during the 1970s, agricultural production evaluations remained focused on the grain yield. Despite some progress, there were still issues such as insufficient domestic fodder crop production and a diminishing sugar beet harvest. Brezhnev attempted to address these concerns by boosting governmental investment and expanding privately owned plots. However, these initiatives were ineffective in addressing fundamental issues such as a lack of skilled personnel, a deteriorating rural culture, and inadequate farm machinery for small collective farms. A considerable reform was required, but it was not supported for ideological and political reasons. Brezhnev's agriculture policy maintained traditional techniques of arranging collective farms. Centralized output quotas remained in place. Brezhnev continued Khrushchev's program of amalgamating farms because he believed that larger kolkhozes would boost output. Brezhnev pushed for an increase in state spending in agriculture, which reached an all-time high of 27% of total state investment in the 1970s, excluding expenditures in farm equipment. Agriculture received $33 billion at today's exchange rate in investment in 1981 alone. Agricultural output in 1980 was 21% greater than the average production rate from 1966 to 1970. Cereal crop output climbed by 18%. The better results were not encouraging. In the Soviet Union, the criterion for judging agricultural productivity was the grain harvest. Cereal imports, which began under Khrushchev, had become a common Soviet practice. When Brezhnev struggled to reach commercial trade deals with the United States, he turned to other countries, including Argentina. Trade was required since the Soviet Union's domestic output of feed grains was critically lacking. Another struggling industry was the sugar beet harvest, which fell by 2% in the 1970s. Brezhnev resolved these challenges by increasing state investment. Politburo member Gennady Voronov argued for the split of each farm's labor into what he dubbed links. These links would be assigned specific responsibilities, such as running a farm's dairy unit. His thesis was that the greater the workforce, the less accountable they felt. Andrei Andreev submitted this idea to Joseph Stalin in the 1940s, and Khrushchev opposed it both before and after Stalin died. Voronov was likewise unsuccessful. Brezhnev rejected him, and in 1973 he was dismissed from the Politburo. Experimentation with links was not prohibited at the local level, with Mikhail Gorbachev, the then first secretary of the Stavropol Regional Committee, experimenting with links in his territory. Meanwhile, Robert Service characterized the Soviet government's engagement in agriculture as unimaginative and incompetent. Faced with rising agricultural challenges, the Politburo passed a resolution titled, "On the Further Development of Specialization and Concentration of Agricultural Production on the Basis of Inter-Farm Cooperation and Agro-Industrial Integration." The resolution directed kolkhozes near to each other to coordinate in their efforts to increase production. Meanwhile, official subsidies to the food and agriculture industry did not prevent insolvent farms from running, and increases in crop prices were counterbalanced by increases in the cost of oil and other resources. In 1977, oil cost 84% more than it did in the late 1960s. The price of other materials had also risen by the late 1970s. Brezhnev responded to these issues by issuing two decrees, one in 1977 and one in 1981, increasing the maximum size of privately owned plots in the Soviet Union to half a hectare. These efforts removed significant barriers to increasing agricultural productivity, but they did not fix the problem. Under Brezhnev, private plots produced 30% of national agricultural production while cultivating only 4% of the land. Some saw this as confirmation that decollectivization was required to save Soviet agriculture from failing, but prominent Soviet leaders resisted such harsh changes owing to ideological and political considerations. The underlying issues were an increasing dearth of qualified labor, a shattered rural culture, worker remuneration based on quantity rather than quality of work, and farm machinery that was too huge for the small communal farms and the roadless countryside. In the face of this, Brezhnev had only two options: huge land reclamation and irrigation projects, or dramatic reform. Society. Brezhnev at International Women's Day celebrations in 1973. Over the 18 years that Brezhnev controlled the Soviet Union, average income per person increased by half, with 3/4 of this rise occurring in the 1960s and early 1970s. During Brezhnev's second term, the average income per capita increased by 1/4. In the first half of the Brezhnev period, income per capita climbed at 3.5% each year, slightly slower than in prior years. This can be explained by Brezhnev's decision to reverse the majority of Khrushchev's policies. Consumption per capita increased by an estimated 70% during Brezhnev, with 3/4 of this rise occurring before 1973 and only 1/4 occurring during the second part of his reign. The Kosygin reform was responsible for the vast majority of the expansion in consumer production during the early Brezhnev era. When the USSR's economic growth halted in the 1970s, the standard of living and home quality rose dramatically. Instead of focusing primarily on the economy, the Soviet leadership under Brezhnev attempted to raise the Soviet Union's living standards by expanding social benefits. This resulted in an increase, albeit slight, in public support. Under Brezhnev, the standard of living in the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, RSFSR, fell behind that of the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic, GSSR, and the Estonian Soviet Socialist Republic, ESSR, leading many Russians to believe that the Soviet government's policies were harming the Russian people. The state frequently transferred workers from one job to another, which eventually became a permanent element of Soviet industry. According to Robert Service, government businesses such as factories, mines, and offices were staffed by undisciplined individuals who made a concerted attempt to avoid executing their responsibilities, resulting in a work-shy workforce. The Soviet government had no effective countermeasure. Replacing unproductive staff was extremely difficult, if not impossible, due to the country's low unemployment rate. While certain areas improved during the Brezhnev era, the majority of civilian services deteriorated and Soviet residents' living standards declined significantly. Diseases were on the rise due to the deteriorating healthcare system. Living space remained relatively tiny by First World standards, with the average Soviet citizen occupying 13.4 square meters. Thousands of Moscow residents became homeless, with most living in shacks, alleyways, and parked trams. Nutrition stopped improving in the late 1970s, and staple food rationing returned to Sverdlovsk, for example. The state supplied recreational facilities and annual holidays to hard-working citizens. Soviet trade unions provided hard-working members and their families with beach vacations in Crimea and Georgia. Social rigidity became a typical trait in Soviet society. During the Stalin era of the 1930s and 1940s, a common laborer could expect to advance to a white-collar job if he studied and obeyed Soviet authorities. In Brezhnev's Soviet Union, this was not true. Holders of desirable jobs clung to them for as long as possible. Plain ineptitude was not regarded as a valid basis to dismiss somebody. In this way, the Soviet society that Brezhnev left behind had also become immobile. Foreign and defense policies. Soviet-U.S. relations. Brezhnev sitting right and United States President Gerald Ford issue a joint communiqué on the SALT Accord in Vladivostok. During his 18 years as Soviet leader, Brezhnev's signature foreign policy innovation was the promotion of détente. While there were some similarities to tactics taken during the Khrushchev thaw, Brezhnev's program diverged dramatically from Khrushchev's precedent in two areas. The first was that its goals were more extensive and broad, encompassing the signature of agreements on arms control, crisis prevention, East-West trade, European security, and human rights. The second pillar of the program emphasized the significance of balancing the military strength of the United States and the Soviet Union, according to who? Between 1965 and 1970, Brezhnev increased defense spending by 40%, with annual increases continuing after that. The military received 12% of the GNP in 1982, the year Brezhnev died. Brezhnev and U.S. President Richard Nixon signed the SALT I Treaty during the 1972 Moscow summit. The first component of the pact limited each side's development of nuclear missiles. The second part of the pact, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, prohibited both countries from developing systems to intercept incoming missiles, ensuring that neither the United States nor the Soviet Union would be able to strike the other without fear of nuclear reprisal. By the mid-1970s, Henry Kissinger's détente policy with the Soviet Union was weakening. The détente was based on the notion that the two countries could form some sort of linkage, with the U.S. expecting that signing SALT I and increasing Soviet-U.S. trade would put an end to the aggressive rise of communism in the Third World. This did not occur, as proven by Brezhnev's ongoing military assistance for communist guerrillas fighting against the United States during the Vietnam War. After Gerald Ford lost the presidential election to Jimmy Carter, American foreign policy became more overtly confrontational in its language against the Soviet Union and the communist world. There were also efforts to halt funding for oppressive anti-communist regimes and groups that the United States sponsored. While initially advocating for a reduction in all defense initiatives, Carter's latter administration saw an increase in military spending in the United States. When Brezhnev authorized the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, Carter, acting on the recommendation of his national security advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, condemned the action as the most serious threat to peace since 1945. The United States suspended all grain supplies to the Soviet Union and boycotted the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow. The Soviet Union retaliated by boycotting the 1984 Summer Olympics, which were held in Los Angeles. Under Brezhnev's leadership, the Soviet Union attained its pinnacle of political and strategic dominance in respect to the United States. As a result of the constraints agreed upon by both superpowers in the First SALT Treaty, the Soviet Union achieved nuclear parity with the United States for the first time during the Cold War. Furthermore, through discussions at the Helsinki Accords, Brezhnev was able to legitimize Soviet rule in Central and Eastern Europe. The Vietnam War. North Vietnamese troops posed in front of a Soviet SA-2 missile launcher. Under Nikita Khrushchev's leadership, the Soviet Union first supported North Vietnam out of fraternal solidarity. However, as the war progressed, Khrushchev persuaded the North Vietnamese leadership to abandon the goal of freeing South Vietnam. He went on to refuse the North Vietnamese government's offer of aid, telling them instead to start negotiations with the United Nations Security Council. After Khrushchev was deposed, Brezhnev continued his support for the communist insurgency in Vietnam. Premier Kosygin visited Hanoi in February 1965, accompanied by a dozen Soviet Air Force generals and economic advisors. Throughout the war, Brezhnev's leadership shipped $450 million in armaments to North Vietnam each year. Lyndon B. Johnson informally indicated to Brezhnev that he would promise an end to South Vietnamese antagonism in exchange for Brezhnev guaranteeing a North Vietnamese one. Brezhnev was initially interested in this offer but rejected it after being informed by Andrei Gromyko that the North Vietnamese were not interested in a diplomatic solution to the conflict. In response to this denial, the Johnson administration expanded American participation in Vietnam, but later encouraged the Soviet Union to discuss an arms control deal. The USSR did not respond, first because of a power struggle between Brezhnev and Kosygin over who might represent Soviet interests abroad, and then because of the intensification of the dirty war in Vietnam. Johnson sought to broker a deal with Ho Chi Minh in early 1967, saying he was willing to cease U.S. bombing attacks in North Vietnam in exchange for Ho's end to his infiltration of South Vietnam. The U.S. bombing raids were suspended for a few days, and Kosygin publicly expressed his support for the deal. The North Vietnamese government did not respond, therefore the U.S. resumed its raids in North Vietnam. Following this episode, Brezhnev believed that seeking diplomatic solutions to the ongoing war in Vietnam was futile. Later that year, Johnson invited Kosygin to the United States to address the escalating Vietnam War and the arms race. The conference was marked by a pleasant mood, but neither side achieved any significant achievements. Following the Sino-Soviet border struggle, the Chinese continued to support the North Vietnamese administration. However, with Ho Chi Minh's death in 1969, China's greatest link to North Vietnam was severed. In the meantime, Richard Nixon was elected President of the United States. While noted for his anti-communist rhetoric, Nixon declared in 1971 that the United States must have relations with Communist China. His objective was to gradually withdraw U.S. forces from South Vietnam while retaining the South Vietnamese government. The only way he thought this was conceivable was to improve relations with both Communist China and the Soviet Union. He later traveled to Moscow to negotiate an arms control deal and the Vietnam War, but no agreement was reached. Years of Soviet military help to North Vietnam eventually paid off when U.S. forces' morale plummeted, forcing them to withdraw completely from South Vietnam by 1973. Paving the way for the country's unification under communist government 2 years later. Chinese-Soviet relations. Deng Xiaoping, left, and Brezhnev, right, meet with Nicolae Ceausescu in Bucharest, 1965. Soviet international ties with the People's Republic of China soon deteriorated following Nikita Khrushchev's attempts to pursue a rapprochement with more liberal Eastern European republics, such as Yugoslavia and the West. When Brezhnev established his power base in the 1960s, China was in turmoil due to Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution, which had decimated the Chinese Communist Party and other ruling institutions. Brezhnev, a realistic politician who advocated for stabilization, couldn't understand why Mao would launch such a self-destructive effort to complete the socialist revolution, according to him. However, Brezhnev faced his own challenges in the form of Czechoslovakia, whose dramatic departure from the Soviet model drove him and the rest of the Warsaw Pact to attack their Eastern Bloc ally. Following the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, which included the overthrow of the reformist government, the Soviet leadership declared the Brezhnev Doctrine, any threat to socialist rule in any Soviet bloc state in Central and Eastern Europe was a threat to all of them, justifying the intervention of fellow socialist states to forcibly remove the threat. The term socialism referred to control by communist parties loyal to the Kremlin. This new approach heightened tensions with both the Eastern Bloc and the Asian communist regimes. By 1969, relations with other communist countries had deteriorated to the point where Brezhnev was unable to gather even 5 of the 14 ruling communist parties. Attend an international conference in Moscow. Following the unsuccessful meeting, the Soviets determined there was no leading center of the international communist movement. In the late 1980s, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev rejected the Brezhnev Doctrine and the Kremlin accepted the peaceful overthrow of Soviet power in all of its Eastern European satellite republics. Later in 1969, the worsening of bilateral relations culminated in the Sino-Soviet border confrontation. Premier Alexei Kosygin was deeply dissatisfied with the Sino-Soviet divide and, for a time, refused to acknowledge its irreversibility. He paid a brief visit to Beijing in 1969 as tensions between the USSR and China rose. In the early 1980s, both the Chinese and the Soviets issued statements advocating for the normalization of relations between the two countries. The Chinese demanded that the Soviets reduce their military presence along the Sino-Soviet border, withdraw their troops from Afghanistan and the Mongolian People's Republic, and stop supporting the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia. Brezhnev reacted in a March 1982 address in Tashkent, calling for normalization of relations. Full Sino-Soviet normalization of relations would take years until the last Soviet president, Mikhail Gorbachev, took power. Intervention in Afghanistan. Following the Communist Revolution in Afghanistan in 1978, the Afghan Civil War erupted as a result of the communist regime's dictatorial tactics against the people, with the Mujahideen leading the popular resistance. The Soviet Union was concerned about losing influence in Central Asia, so when a KGB report stated that Afghanistan might be captured in a matter of weeks, Brezhnev and numerous high party officials consented to a complete intervention. Contemporary researchers tend to assume that Brezhnev was uninformed about the situation in Afghanistan. His health had deteriorated and supporters of direct military intervention gained control of the Politburo by cheating and fabricating evidence. They recommended for a more moderate scenario with a cadre of 1,500 to 2,500 Soviet military advisors and technicians in the nation who had already been present in huge numbers during the 1950s. But they disagreed on sending regular army formations totaling hundreds of thousands of men. Some believe Brezhnev signed the decree without being told the complete picture, otherwise he would not have supported such a decision. Anatoly Dobrinin, the Soviet ambassador to the United States, believed that Mikhail Suslov was the real architect behind the invasion and had misled Brezhnev. Brezhnev's personal physician, Mikhail Kozyrev, later stated that when Brezhnev was in his right mind, he opposed the full-scale intervention. Deputy Chairman of the State Duma Vladimir Zhirinovsky declared officially that despite the military solution being advocated by some, hardline Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov was the sole Politburo member who insisted on sending regular army units. Some members of the Soviet military establishment opposed any active Soviet military participation in Afghanistan, arguing that the Soviet Union should leave Afghan politics alone. The invasion of Czechoslovakia. During the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia, a Soviet T-55 tank catches fire as it battles Czech demonstrators. Brezhnev's rule faced its first crisis in 1968 when Czechoslovakia's communist leadership, led by Alexander Dubček, attempted to liberalize the communist system, Prague Spring. In July, Brezhnev publicly attacked Czechoslovak leadership as revisionist and anti-Soviet. Despite his strict public remarks, when the Politburo debated the use of military force in Czechoslovakia, Brezhnev was not the most vocal advocate. According to archival evidence, Brezhnev was one of the few hoping for a temporary truce with the reform-friendly Czechoslovak government as their disagreement reached a climax. However, Brezhnev ultimately judged that abstaining or voting against Soviet assistance in Czechoslovakia would risk more domestic and Eastern Bloc upheaval. Brezhnev, under pressure from the Soviet leadership to reinstall a revolutionary government in Prague, ordered the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia and the ouster of Dubček in August, following the Soviet intervention. He met with Czechoslovak reformer Bohumil Simon, then a member of the Czechoslovak Communist Party's Politburo, and stated, "If I had not voted for Soviet armed assistance to Czechoslovakia, you would not be sitting here today. And quite possibly neither would I." However, contrary to the stabilizing effect expected by Moscow, the invasion served as a fuel for increasing unrest across the Eastern Bloc. The Brezhnev Doctrine. Brezhnev declared that the Soviet Union had the right to intervene in the internal affairs of its satellites in order to safeguard socialism following the crushing of the Prague Spring. This became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine, despite the fact that it was essentially a restatement of previous Soviet doctrine which Khrushchev implemented in Hungary in 1956. Brezhnev restated the theory in a speech to the Fifth Congress of the Polish United Workers' Party on November 13, 1968. When forces adverse to socialism attempt to shift the growth of a socialist country toward capitalism, it becomes an issue and concern for all socialist countries, not just the one in question. The advent of the Solidarity movement in 1980 triggered a political crisis in Poland. Solidarity had 3 million members at the end of October and 9 million by December. In a public opinion poll conducted by the Polish government, 89% of respondents favored Solidarity. With the Polish government split on what to do, the majority refused to institute martial law as proposed by Wojciech Jaruzelski. The Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc countries were unclear how to handle the crisis, while East Germany's Erich Honecker pushed for military intervention. In an official letter to Brezhnev, Honecker urged a coordinated military response to Poland's increasing issues. A CIA report suggested that the Soviet military was preparing for an invasion. In 1980-81, representatives from Eastern Bloc countries gathered in the Kremlin to discuss the Polish situation. On December 10, 1981, Brezhnev concluded that it would be best to leave Poland's domestic affairs alone, promising Polish delegates that the USSR would only act if asked to. This effectively ended the Brezhnev Doctrine. Despite the lack of Soviet military participation, Wojciech Jaruzelski eventually caved into Moscow's demands by declaring a state of war, the Polish equivalent of martial law, on December 13, 1981. Cult of personality. A developing personality cult emerged during Brezhnev's final years in power. His love of medals, he received over 100, was well known, so on his 60th birthday in December 1966, he was named a hero of the Soviet Union. Brezhnev received the medal, which included the Order of Lenin and the Gold Star, 3 more times in honor of his birthdays. On his 70th birthday, he received the rank of Marshal of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union's highest military decoration. After receiving the rank, he visited an 18th Army Veterans meeting, clad in a big coat and shouting, "Attention, the Marshal is coming." He also conferred upon himself the Uncommon Order of Victory in 1978. This was cancelled posthumously in 1989 since it did not match the citation criteria. A promotion to the rank of Generalissimus of the Soviet Union, scheduled for Brezhnev's 75th birthday, was quietly cancelled due to his continued health issues. Brezhnev's desire for unearned fame was evident in his poorly written memoirs on his military experience during World War II, which portrayed small clashes around Novorossiysk as a significant military theater. Despite his book's obvious flaws, it received the Lenin Prize for Literature and was praised by the Soviet press. 2 more publications followed, one of which focused on the Virgin Lands campaign. Health problems. Brezhnev's personality cult grew at a time when his health was rapidly deteriorating. His physical health was worsening. He had been a heavy smoker until the 1970s, had developed an addiction to sleeping medications and tranquilizers, and had started drinking excessively. His niece Lyubov Brezhneva attributed his dependencies and overall decline to severe depression caused by, in addition to the stress of his job and the country's general situation, an extremely unhappy family life. With near-daily conflicts with his wife and children, particularly his troubled daughter Galina, whose erratic behavior, failed marriages, and involvement in corruption wreaked havoc on Brezhnev's mental and physical health. Brezhnev had considered divorcing his wife and disowning his children several times, but his extended family and the Politburo intervened, fearing unwanted publicity, and persuaded him otherwise. Over the years, he had gained weight. Brezhnev's central nervous system deteriorated chronically between 1973 and his death, and he suffered many small strokes and insomnia. In 1975, he had his first heart attack. When Brezhnev received the Lenin Order, he moved shakily and botched his speech. According to one American intelligence expert, U.S. officials were aware for several years that Brezhnev had acute arteriosclerosis and that he also had other unnamed diseases. In 1977, American intelligence agencies openly indicated that Brezhnev had been suffering from gout and leukemia, an emphysema caused by decades of excessive smoking as well as chronic bronchitis. He was reportedly equipped with a pacemaker to control his irregular heart rhythms. On occasion, he was reported to have memory loss, speech difficulty, and coordination issues. According to the Washington Post, all of this is said to be taking a toll on Brezhnev's mood. He is claimed to be melancholy, saddened by his own declining health, and dismayed by the deaths of several of his longtime colleagues. To help, he has sought regular counseling and hypnosis from an Assyrian woman, a modern-day Rasputin. Brezhnev's ability to govern the Soviet Union was severely hampered after he suffered a stroke in 1975. As his authority to define Soviet foreign policy diminished, he increasingly turned to the views of a hardline brain trust that included KGB chairman Yuri Andropov, veteran foreign minister Andrei Gromyko, and defense minister Andrei Grechko, who was succeeded by Dmitry Ustinov in 1976. The Ministry of Health had doctors by Brezhnev's side at all times, and he was saved from certain death on multiple occasions. At the moment, most senior CPSU officers wished to keep Brezhnev alive, even if an increasing number of officials were disgruntled with his policies. No one in the government wanted to risk a new era of domestic upheaval that may be caused by his death. Last years and death. Brezhnev's health worsened throughout the winter of 1981-82. While the Politburo debated who would succeed, all indicators suggested that the ill leader was dying. Suslov might have affected the choice of successor, but he died in January 1982 at the age of 79. Andropov took Suslov's seat in the Central Committee Secretariat. By May, it was clear that Andropov would run for the position of General Secretary. In an attempt to create a hostile environment in the Politburo, he began disseminating accusations that political corruption had worsened during Brezhnev's tenure as leader with the assistance of other KGB associates. Andropov's actions showed that he had no fear of Brezhnev's wrath. While inspecting a plant in Tashkent in March 1982, Brezhnev suffered a concussion and broke his right collarbone when a metal balustrade fell under the weight of a number of factory workers, falling on top of Brezhnev and his security detail. This episode was presented by Western media as Brezhnev having a stroke. After a month of rest, Brezhnev worked intermittently until November. On November 7, 1982, he was standing on the balcony of the Lenin Mausoleum during the annual military parade and labor demonstration commemorating the 65th anniversary of the October Revolution. The ceremony marked Brezhnev's final public appearance before his death 3 days later from a heart attack. Following a 3-day period of national mourning, he received a state funeral. He was interred in the Kremlin Wall necropolis in Red Square, in one of 12 individual tombs situated between the Lenin Mausoleum and the wall. National and international leaders from around the world attended his funeral. His wife and family were also there. Brezhnev was dressed for burial in his marshal's uniform and honors. Legacy. Except for Joseph Stalin, Brezhnev was the Soviet Union's longest-serving leader. He is frequently chastised for the extended era of stagnation during which core economic problems were overlooked and the Soviet political system was allowed to deteriorate. During Mikhail Gorbachev's presidency, there was a surge in criticism of the Brezhnev years, such as assertions that Brezhnev followed a fierce neo-Stalinist line. The Gorbachevian discourse condemned Brezhnev for failing to modernize the country and move with the times, but in a subsequent comment, Gorbachev assured that Brezhnev was not as horrible as he was made out to be, saying, "Brezhnev was nothing like the cartoon figure that is made of him now." One of his most important actions was the intervention in Afghanistan, which drastically weakened both the Soviet Union's worldwide standing and domestic strength. In Brezhnev's defense, the Soviet Union achieved unparalleled and unrivaled levels of power, prestige, and internal tranquility throughout his reign. Brezhnev has performed admirably in opinion polls when compared to his successors and predecessors in Russia. In a 2007 VT Asylum Opinion Survey, the majority of Russians preferred to live during the Brezhnev era above any other period of 20th century Soviet history. In a 2013 Levada Center poll, Brezhnev topped Vladimir Lenin as Russia's favorite leader of the 20th century, receiving 56% support, 146 in another poll conducted in 2013. Brezhnev was rated the best Russian leader of the 20th century. In a 2018 rating sociological group study, 47% of Ukrainians had a favorable opinion of Brezhnev. Personality traits. Roy Medvedev, a Russian historian, stresses Brezhnev's bureaucratic mentality and psychological qualities, which allowed him to attain power. He was devoted to his friends, vain in his desire for ceremonial power, and refused to regulate corruption inside the party. Brezhnev increasingly made significant decisions on his own without consulting his Politburo colleagues, particularly in foreign policy. He purposefully projected numerous personas to different people, ending in a methodical glorification of his own profession. Brezhnev's vanity made him the subject of several political jokes. Nikolai Podgorny warned him about this, but Brezhnev said, "If they are making fun of me, it means they like me." Throughout his career, Brezhnev kissed many politicians on the lips, as was customary among socialists. One of these times with Erich Honecker was the inspiration for My God, Help Me to Survive This Deadly Love, a mural painted on the Berlin Wall following its construction and dismantlement. Brezhnev's greatest hobby was driving foreign cars that had been gifted to him by international leaders. He regularly drove these between his dacha and the Kremlin with blatant disregard for public safety, according to historian Robert Service. When visiting the United States for a summit with Richard Nixon in 1973, he expressed a willingness to drive about Washington in a Lincoln Continental that Nixon had recently given him. When told that the Secret Service would not allow him to do so, he said, "I will remove the flag from the car, put on dark glasses so they can't see my brows, and drive like any American would," to which Henry Kissinger replied, "I have driven with you, and I don't think you drive like an American." Personal life. Brezhnev was married to Victoria Denisova 1908 to 1995. He had 2 children, Galina, his daughter, and Yuri, his son. In 1995, his niece Lyubov Brezhneva wrote a memoir claiming that Brezhnev worked methodically to provide his family with advantages such as appointments, homes, private luxury stores, private medical facilities, and immunity to prosecution. Brezhnev had an apartment at 26 Kutuzovsky Prospect, the same building as Mikhail Suslov. So friends, before you go, please let us know that we have made this video on the history with great effort. Tell us how you liked it in the comments below and connect with us by subscribing to our channel and pressing the bell button. Do it! If you want to know about any history, you can definitely give us ideas in the comments below. Next time we will make a video according to you.